The applause inside NBC Studio 3 rolled like thunder across the polished wooden floor. Stage lights reflected off polished brass instruments as the orchestra finished its opening number. Hundreds of audience members adjusted themselves in their seats, whispering excitedly to one another. Cameras slowly glided across the stage, searching for the next unforgettable television moment. It was March 1971. The Andy Williams Show was one of the biggest programs in America, and tonight's guest was someone who needed no introduction, Elvis Presley. Backstage, however, there was none of the swagger audiences expected. Elvis stood quietly beside a dressing room mirror, staring at his own reflection. His black suit had been perfectly tailored. Every strand of hair sat exactly where it belonged. Yet his eyes betrayed exhaustion. Charlie Hodge entered carefully. "They're ready whenever you are." Elvis didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward a small envelope resting on the makeup table. It wasn't fan mail. It wasn't business. It had arrived only 2 hours earlier. Charlie noticed Elvis staring at it. "You gonna read it again?" Elvis slowly nodded. "I can't get it out of my head." He unfolded the letter for what must have been the 10th time. The paper was worn from being handled so often. The handwriting wasn't elegant. Some words were crooked, others were written larger than the rest, as though the writer's hands had trembled while trying to finish. The first line read, "Dear Mr. Presley." Elvis swallowed. He continued silently, "My name is Danny Carter. I'm 9 years old. The doctors told my mama I probably won't make it to Easter. I know you're busy. I don't want money. I don't want toys. I only want to hear you sing one song while I'm there. If I can't come to your concert, maybe God will let me hear you another way." Elvis closed his eyes. Charlie remained silent. He had seen thousands of fan letters over the years. Most asked for autographs. Some wanted money. Others simply declared their love. This one felt different. There was no request for fame, no demand. Only a little boy trying not to waste anyone's time. Charlie finally spoke. "Colonel says security already checked it out." Elvis looked up. "So it's real?" Charlie nodded. "The family's from Bakersfield." Elvis leaned back against the table. "How sick?" Charlie hesitated. "The doctors say leukemia." Silence, long enough that even the distant sounds from the audience seemed to disappear. Finally, Elvis whispered, 9 years old. He folded the letter with extraordinary care. "My little Lisa ain't much younger." Charlie didn't answer. He knew better. Whenever children were involved, Elvis became someone entirely different. The superstar disappeared. The father remained. Across Los Angeles, nearly 90 miles away, a faded blue station wagon slowly pulled into the NBC parking lot. Danny Carter sat in the passenger seat, wrapped inside a denim jacket several sizes too large. His baseball cap hid most of his thinning blonde hair. Chemotherapy had taken almost everything else. His mother Margaret glanced toward him. "You feeling all right?" Danny smiled weakly. "I'm okay." He wasn't. Every bump in the road had hurt. Every breath required effort. But he had promised himself something. He wouldn't complain today. Not today. Today was Elvis Day. Behind them, Danny's grandfather, Walter Carter, quietly carried a worn leather guitar case. It looked ancient. The corners were frayed. One latch barely stayed shut anymore. Danny noticed him holding it. "You brought Grandpa's guitar," Walter smiled. "Wouldn't miss it." Danny laughed softly. "You always bring that thing. Walter looked at the old case as though it contained part of his life. It kept food on our table once. Danny loved hearing that story. Years before rock and roll had existed, before television, before Elvis had become a legend, Walter had traveled from town to town playing country songs for spare coins. That guitar had survived rain, dust storms, broken strings, empty pockets, marriage, war, children, everything. Now Walter's hands shook too much to play. But he never left it behind. Never. Inside Studio 3, producers hurried through final preparations. Andy Williams stood reading cue cards when producer Martin Klein rushed toward him. "We've got the Carter family here." Andy smiled. "Wonderful." Martin lowered his voice. "Elvis wants no publicity." "What do you mean?" "He doesn't want cameras following the boy backstage." Andy paused. "That's unusual." Martin nodded. "He said..." Martin glanced around before finishing. "He said sick children deserve dignity, not headlines." Andy slowly smiled. "That's why people love him." Meanwhile, Danny entered the building. Everything seemed enormous. Bright lights, massive television cameras, people wearing headsets running in every direction. For a moment he forgot he was sick. He looked like any excited 9-year-old seeing television magic for the first time. One stage assistant knelt beside him. "You nervous?" Danny grinned. "A little." "You ever met Elvis before?" Danny laughed. "No." "What are you going to say?" Danny thought for a long moment, then answered honestly. "I don't know." The assistant smiled. "Good answer." Backstage, Elvis was warming up quietly when someone knocked. Charlie opened the door. "It's the family." Elvis stood immediately. "No cameras?" Charlie nodded. "Just us." "Good." The door slowly opened. Danny stepped inside. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The room felt strangely quiet. Danny had imagined this moment hundreds of times. He expected fireworks, music, magic. Instead, he found a man smiling gently at him. Not a king, not a superstar, just Elvis. Elvis slowly knelt until they were eye level. "So," he said softly, "you're Danny." Danny nodded. "Yes, sir." Elvis extended his hand. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." Danny carefully shook it. His tiny fingers disappeared inside Elvis's hand. Neither realized the photographers waiting outside would never capture what happened next. Because no camera had been allowed inside, only memories. Elvis looked at Walter. "And you must be Grandpa." Walter tipped his hat proudly. Elvis noticed the old guitar case. "You still play?" Walter chuckled. "Not near as good as I used to." "You mind if I see her?" Walter carefully opened the worn case. Inside rested a scarred, old acoustic guitar. Its finish had almost completely disappeared. Elvis gently picked it up. He ran his fingers across countless scratches. Every mark told a story. "This guitar's lived." Walter nodded. "So have I." Elvis smiled. "I like that." Danny watched every second. His eyes sparkled brighter than anyone had seen in months. Elvis strummed a single chord. The old guitar responded with a warm, imperfect sound. Not polished, not expensive. Beautiful anyway. Elvis looked toward Danny. "You know," he said, "perfect guitars don't tell stories." Danny frowned. "What tells stories?" Elvis looked down at the weathered wood. "The ones that survive." Danny never forgot those words. Neither would anyone else who heard them. A stage manager suddenly entered. "Mr. Presley." "We're live in 3 minutes." Elvis carefully returned the guitar, then looked directly at Danny. "I got an idea." Danny tilted his head. "What kind of idea?" Elvis smiled. "The kind nobody knows about yet." He leaned closer. "When Andy introduces me, I want you sitting right beside the stage." Danny blinked. "Really?" "I've got a feeling tonight," Elvis paused, "isn't going to go the way anybody expects." Danny looked at his mother. She was already wiping away tears. Walter quietly closed the guitar case. None of them could have imagined that within the next hour, America would witness one of the most unforgettable moments ever to happen on live television. And none of them, not even Elvis himself, could have guessed that only 72 hours later, the meaning of that night would change forever. The studio lights dimmed. A single spotlight swept across the polished stage as the orchestra began playing the unmistakable introduction to "You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin'." The audience erupted. Andy Williams walked to center stage with his familiar warm smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, pausing as applause continued to swell. "Our guest tonight hardly needs an introduction. He's one of the greatest entertainers America has ever known." The applause grew louder. "Please welcome Elvis Presley." The curtains slowly opened. Elvis stepped into the light. Dressed in a black tailored suit with a wide collar and polished boots, he smiled, waved, and acknowledged the audience. Hundreds of people immediately stood to their feet. The applause became deafening. But instead of walking directly to the microphone, Elvis glanced toward the front row. Danny sat exactly where Elvis had requested. The little boy's baseball cap nearly covered his eyes. His face was pale. His body looked impossibly small inside the oversized denim jacket. Yet when their eyes met, Danny smiled, and Elvis smiled back. Only then did he walk toward the microphone. The first song ended with thunderous applause. Then another, and another. For nearly 20 minutes, Elvis filled the studio with laughter, charm, and music. Nobody watching at home suspected anything unusual. The producers were pleased. The sponsors were smiling. Everything was running exactly according to schedule, until Elvis quietly walked toward Andy Williams. Andy leaned closer. "You ready?" Elvis nodded. "But not for what's written on those cue cards." Andy looked confused. "What do you mean?" Elvis reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out Danny's letter. "I'd like to do something." Andy glanced toward the producers. Several of them immediately shook their heads. Live television was carefully timed. Nothing unexpected, nothing emotional, nothing unscripted. That was the rule. Elvis looked toward the control booth. "If they want to cut the cameras," he said calmly, "they can." The room fell silent. Andy looked into Elvis's eyes. He could see this wasn't a publicity stunt. It wasn't improvisation. It was something deeply personal. Andy slowly folded the cue cards. "You've got the stage." Millions of viewers across America leaned closer to their television sets. Elvis adjusted the microphone. For the first time all evening, he wasn't smiling. "I receive thousands of letters every month." His voice was gentle. "I wish I could answer every one." He unfolded the worn paper. "A few days ago, I received one that I haven't been able to stop thinking about." The studio became perfectly still. He read only a few lines. Not all of it. Just enough. "I don't want toys. I don't want money. I only want to hear you sing one song while I'm there." The audience lowered their heads. Several people were already crying. Elvis carefully folded the letter again. "The little fellow who wrote this," he pointed toward the front row, "is here tonight." Every camera turned. Danny froze. He hadn't expected this. Margaret instinctively held her son's hand. The audience erupted into applause. Danny looked embarrassed. He tried to hide behind his cap. Elvis smiled softly. "Come here, son." Danny looked at his mother. She nodded through tears. Walter gently squeezed Danny's shoulder. "You go." The entire studio watched as Danny slowly walked toward the stage. Every step looked difficult. Halfway there, he stumbled. Before anyone else could move, Elvis stepped off the stage. He caught Danny before he could fall. The audience gasped. Elvis knelt. "You all right?" Danny laughed quietly. "I forgot my legs get tired." Elvis smiled. "Happens to the best of us." Instead of helping Danny climb the stairs, Elvis lifted him into his arms. The audience burst into applause once again. Even members of the orchestra began wiping away tears. Andy Williams quietly stepped aside. This was no longer his show. This belonged to someone else. Once on stage, Elvis placed Danny on a wooden stool beside him. "So," Elvis asked, "you finally made it." Danny nodded. "I wasn't sure I would." Those 7 words struck the room like lightning. No music, no applause, only silence. Elvis gently rested one hand on Danny's shoulder. "I'm mighty glad you did." Andy walked over carrying a second microphone. "What song did you want to hear?" Danny looked at Elvis. His answer came without hesitation. "Love Me Tender." Elvis smiled. "I had a feeling." The orchestra quietly prepared, but Elvis raised one hand. "No." Everyone looked confused. "I'd like to do this one alone." The musicians respectfully lowered their instruments. One spotlight remained. Elvis took an acoustic guitar from a nearby stand, the same guitar he had planned to use later in the show. He gently strummed the opening chords. His voice filled the studio, soft, warm, almost like he wasn't performing for millions of viewers, only for one little boy. Danny never took his eyes off him. When Elvis reached the chorus, he stopped singing. He looked at Danny. "You know the words?" Danny nodded shyly. "A little." "Then help me." Danny's voice was tiny, weak, sometimes almost impossible to hear. Yet together, their voices somehow filled the room. Several audience members openly sobbed. Even camera operators blinked away tears. Nobody cared about television schedules anymore. When the song ended, there wasn't immediate applause. There couldn't be. The room needed a moment to breathe. Finally, everyone stood. The standing ovation seemed endless. Some clapped, some cried. Others simply watched the two of them sitting together beneath the lights. Andy returned. "I've hosted this program for many years." His voice trembled. "I've never seen anything quite like this." Elvis smiled politely. Then he turned toward Walter. "Grandpa," Walter stood, "would you bring me that guitar?" Walter looked puzzled. "The old one?" "Yes, sir." Walter carried the weathered guitar case toward the stage. Elvis accepted it carefully. He opened it slowly. The old wood reflected beneath the bright television lights, the scratches, the faded finish, the cracked leather strap. Every scar spoke of decades gone by. Danny stared at it. "It looks beautiful." Walter smiled. "She's older than your daddy." The audience laughed softly. Elvis held the guitar with incredible respect. "You know," he said, "people always ask me about expensive guitars." He ran his fingers across the worn body. "But this This reminds me of where music really comes from." He played a slow blues chord. The guitar answered with a warm, imperfect voice. Danny's eyes widened. "It sounds alive." Elvis nodded. "Exactly." He looked at Walter. "May I ask you something?" "Anything." "How long have you owned her?" Walter thought carefully. "Since 1938. I was 19. I played county fairs, dance halls, church picnics. I even carried her overseas during the war." The audience listened in complete silence. Walter smiled. "My wife used to say, 'As long as you come home with that guitar, I'll know you came home safe.'" Margaret quietly wiped another tear. Danny looked at his grandfather with admiration. He had heard pieces of that story before, but never like this, never in front of millions. Elvis slowly closed the guitar case. Then something unexpected happened. He walked over to his own instrument, a beautifully worn electric guitar that had accompanied him through countless rehearsals and television appearances. He looked down at it for several seconds, almost as though remembering every stage it had ever seen. Andy noticed the expression. "You all right?" Elvis nodded. "I've been thinking." He turned toward Danny. "Earlier today, you asked if you could hold my guitar." Danny blushed. "I didn't mean to ask for it. I just thought—" "It was beautiful," Elvis smiled. "I know." He walked toward the little boy. Without another word, he carefully placed the guitar across Danny's lap. The audience smiled. Everyone assumed Elvis simply wanted Danny to hold it for a photograph. But Elvis didn't take it back. Instead, he quietly stepped away. The room suddenly fell silent again. Then Elvis said the words no one expected. "Son, I want you to keep it." Danny looked up, completely confused. "What?" "I want you to have it." Danny shook his head. "I can't." "It's yours." Elvis smiled gently. "Not anymore." Danny looked at his mother, then at Walter, then back at Elvis. "I don't have anything to give you." Elvis knelt beside him. "You already did." Danny frowned. "What?" Elvis's voice became almost a whisper. "You reminded me why I started singing in the first place." The audience erupted into tears and applause all at once. But none of them realized the most heartbreaking moment of the story had not yet arrived. Because while America celebrated the unforgettable gift they had just witnessed live on television, far away in a quiet hospital office, Danny's doctor was reading a new set of test results, and the expression on his face told a devastating truth. The little boy had far less time left than anyone had dared to hope. The standing ovation continued long after the television cameras faded to commercial. People in the audience refused to sit down. Some applauded. Others simply stared at the stage, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Veteran cameramen, men who had covered presidential speeches, moon landing broadcasts, and championship fights, quietly wiped tears from their faces. Even the orchestra remained seated, holding their instruments without speaking. No one wanted to break the moment. Backstage, however, reality returned much faster than anyone expected. Danny's small body had begun to shake. At first, Margaret assumed he was simply overwhelmed by the excitement. But then she noticed his breathing. It had become shallow, uneven. Walter immediately recognized the signs. He had seen them before. "Danny," he whispered, "you all right, buddy?" Danny forced another smile. "I'm just tired." Before anyone could answer, His knees gave way. Elvis caught him before he reached the floor. "Get a doctor!" Charlie Hodge shouted. Several crew members rushed through the hallway. Within seconds, the studio physician arrived carrying a black medical bag. He examined Danny while everyone watched in complete silence. The doctor looked at Margaret. "We need to get him to the hospital. Immediately." Outside NBC studios, an ambulance waited with its lights flashing. Reporters had already gathered behind police barriers. They had heard rumors that something emotional had happened inside. No one yet knew the details. When Elvis walked out carrying Danny in his arms, camera flashes exploded everywhere. Questions flew from every direction. "Elvis! What happened? Is the boy all right? Was that planned?" Elvis ignored every microphone. He carefully helped the paramedics place Danny onto the stretcher. Then he bent close enough that only Danny could hear. "You hang in there." Danny nodded weakly. "You still owe me another song." Elvis smiled. "I sure do." The ambulance doors closed. As the vehicle disappeared into the Los Angeles night, Elvis remained standing on the sidewalk. He never moved. Not until the flashing lights vanished from sight. The following morning, America couldn't stop talking about what had happened. Every newspaper carried photographs from the broadcast. "Elvis gives guitar to dying boy." "Live TV moment moves nation." Viewers flood NBC with calls. Television stations replayed the performance. Radio hosts discussed it between songs. Church pastors mentioned it during Sunday sermons. People who had never agreed on anything suddenly found themselves united by one image. A little boy holding a guitar. A superstar kneeling beside him. At Graceland, stacks of mail began arriving faster than anyone could count. Thousands of letters. Some contained prayers. Others contained money for Danny's medical bills. Children mailed drawings. Veterans mailed medals. Musicians mailed guitar picks. One elderly woman from Kansas enclosed $20 with a short note. "I don't have much. Please give this to the little fellow." Elvis personally read dozens of them. Then he pushed the stack aside. "None of this matters." Charlie looked up. "What do you mean?" "I need to see him." That afternoon, Elvis quietly boarded the Lisa Marie Convair airplane. No reporters, no photographers, no press release. Only Charlie Hodge and one security guard accompanied him. Within hours, they landed in California. Instead of checking into a hotel, Elvis asked the driver one question. "Where's the hospital?" "St. Vincent Medical Center, room 417. Margaret sat beside Danny's bed, gently brushing her son's forehead with a cool cloth. Machines quietly hummed. An oxygen tube rested beneath Danny's nose. His eyes remained closed. The door opened softly. Margaret looked up. She froze. "Mr. Presley." Elvis smiled gently. "Mind if I come in?" She immediately stood. "You don't have to ask." Elvis walked toward the bed. For a long moment, he simply looked at Danny. The little boy seemed even smaller than he had 2 days earlier. His face had lost nearly all its color. The guitar rested in the corner of the room. A nurse had carefully placed it on a stand. Danny had refused to let anyone take it home. The doctor quietly entered. "Mr. Presley." Elvis stepped into the hallway. "How is he?" The doctor hesitated, then sighed. "The leukemia has spread much faster than we expected." Elvis lowered his head. "How much time?" The doctor remained silent for several seconds. "We're measuring it in days now." "Not weeks. Days." Elvis leaned against the wall. He had buried friends before. He had attended funerals. He had watched careers disappear overnight. But hearing those words about a 9-year-old child felt different, much different. Inside the room, Danny slowly opened his eyes. His voice was barely audible. "Elvis!" Elvis immediately returned to his bedside. "I'm right here," Danny smiled. "I dreamed you." "No, sir." "I'm real." Danny looked toward the guitar. "I still got it." "You sure do." "I've been holding it." "I know." "You think," Danny paused to catch his breath, "you could play it one more time?" Elvis looked toward the instrument, then back at Danny. "I'd be honored." He carefully lifted the guitar. The room became silent. There were no cameras now, no audience, no applause. Only a hospital room filled with quiet hope. Elvis sat beside the bed. He gently tuned the strings. One nurse quietly stepped into the hallway. Another called for several doctors. Within minutes, people from throughout the hospital began gathering outside room 417. No one wanted to interrupt, but everyone wanted to listen. Elvis began softly singing, "Love Me Tender." His voice was lower than it had been on television, more intimate, almost like a lullaby. Danny closed his eyes. Margaret quietly cried into Walter's shoulder. Even the nurses stopped pretending not to cry. When Elvis finished, Danny whispered, "Again?" Elvis laughed softly. "You drive a hard bargain." So he sang another, then another. "Peace in the valley, how great thou art. Can't help falling in love." Nearly an hour passed. Nobody looked at a clock. Finally, Danny reached beneath his pillow. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote something." Elvis accepted it. "What is it?" "My song." "You wrote a song?" Danny nodded proudly. "I tried." The paper contained only 4 short verses. The words weren't perfect. Some lines didn't rhyme, several words were misspelled, but every sentence came straight from a child's heart. The final line read, "If heaven has music, maybe I'll save you a seat." Elvis stopped reading. His eyes filled with tears. For several seconds, he couldn't speak. Finally, he folded the paper carefully and placed it inside his jacket pocket. "I'm keeping this forever," Danny smiled. "I hoped you would." Before leaving, Elvis stood beside the hospital bed. "I'll come back tomorrow." Danny slowly shook his head. "I don't think I'll still be here." Margaret quietly turned away. Walter removed his glasses. No one corrected the boy. No one told him he was wrong. Because deep inside, they feared he wasn't. Elvis gently placed one hand over Danny's. "You listen to me. No matter what happens, you are never going to be forgotten." Danny looked toward the guitar one last time. "Promise?" "I promise." As Elvis walked toward the door, Danny called after him one final time. "Elvis?" He turned around. "Yes, buddy? If people ask, tell them I wasn't scared." Elvis felt his throat tighten. "I will." He quietly closed the door behind him. Standing alone in the empty hallway, he looked through the small window into room 417. Danny had already fallen asleep. Still, one tiny hand rested firmly on the neck of the guitar. Elvis whispered to himself, "Hold on just a little longer, son." But somewhere deep inside, he already knew. The next phone call would change him forever. Elvis returned to Memphis just before sunrise. The flight had been almost completely silent. Charlie Hodge tried several times to start a conversation, but each time he stopped himself. There simply wasn't anything to say. Elvis sat beside the window with Danny's handwritten song folded neatly inside his jacket pocket. Every few minutes, he would touch the paper to make sure it was still there. Not because he thought it would disappear, because it reminded him that the little boy was still alive. For now. Back at Graceland, life continued as if nothing had happened. Fans gathered outside the gates, tour buses rolled past, telephones rang non-stop, business managers waited for signatures, movie producers left messages. The Colonel wanted to discuss upcoming appearances, but Elvis ignored everything. He walked into the music room. No one followed. The room was filled with guitars collected throughout his career. Some had traveled across the country with him. Others had been gifts from fellow musicians. Some were worth thousands of dollars. Yet none of them interested him. He sat alone at the piano. For nearly an hour, he played only one melody. Love Me Tender. Slowly, quietly, almost like a prayer. At exactly 8:17 the following morning, the telephone rang. Charlie answered. His expression changed almost immediately. He slowly looked toward Elvis. Neither man spoke. Charlie didn't have to. Elvis already knew. He quietly walked across the room. His hands trembled as he lifted the receiver. "Margaret?" he whispered. On the other end, Danny's mother struggled to speak through tears. "He left us." Silence. "He passed away just after 6 this morning." Elvis closed his eyes. "He wasn't alone," Margaret continued. "He was holding your guitar. He wouldn't let anyone take it away. The nurses tried to place it beside the bed, but Danny wrapped both arms around it. He fell asleep, and he never woke up." Elvis lowered his head. A single tear rolled onto the polished floor beneath him. "I promised him," he whispered, "that he wouldn't be forgotten." 3 days later, a small white church outside Bakersfield filled beyond capacity. People stood in the hallways, outside the building, even along the front steps. Most had never met Danny Carter. Some had traveled hundreds of miles. Others simply remembered the television broadcast. Every pew contained flowers sent from complete strangers. Children had mailed handwritten letters. Schools organized collections. Church choirs sent wreaths. The nation had somehow adopted one little boy as its own. Near the front of the church rested Danny's casket. Across it lay a single white rose. Beside it stood the guitar, exactly as Danny had left it. A quiet murmur spread through the congregation. Someone had arrived, without bodyguards, without flashing cameras, without reporters. Elvis Presley entered through the back door wearing a simple black suit. No jewelry, no stage clothes, no sunglasses. He wasn't there as a celebrity. He was there as a friend. Margaret walked toward him. Without saying a word, she embraced him. Both of them cried. Walter stepped forward. His weathered hands rested on Elvis's shoulder. "He loved you." Elvis answered softly, "I loved him too." The pastor invited Elvis to say a few words. At first, he declined, but then he noticed dozens of children sitting together near the front. Some were holding toy guitars, others carried flowers. Danny's classmates. Elvis slowly walked to the podium. He unfolded a small piece of paper, not a speech, Danny's song. He looked across the church. "I've stood in front of crowds my whole life." He paused. "I've sung for presidents. I've sung in sold-out arenas. I've heard applause louder than thunder. But I've never met anyone braver than a 9-year-old little boy who knew his time was short and still spent every minute making other people smile. The church became silent. Elvis lifted Danny's handwritten page. A few days ago, he gave me this. He called it his song. I think it belongs to all of us now. His voice shook as he read the final verse. If heaven has music, maybe I'll save you a seat. Many people openly wept. Even the pastor lowered his head. Elvis carefully folded the paper again. I've sung thousands of songs, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve these 4 lines. After the service, Walter approached Elvis carrying the guitar. It's yours. Elvis looked confused. No. Danny said so. Walter smiled gently. The night after the television show, he told me something. Elvis listened carefully. Walter continued. He said, Grandpa, if I don't get better, don't let anybody lock this guitar in a closet. Tell Elvis to find another kid who needs hope more than I do. Elvis couldn't speak. Walter placed the guitar into his hands. He wanted it to keep traveling. Elvis stared at the instrument for a very long time. Finally, he nodded. I'll keep that promise. Months passed. Life slowly returned to normal. Concerts resumed. Recording sessions continued. Television appearances filled Elvis's schedule once again. But something had changed. Before every concert, he quietly asked one question. Are there any sick children backstage tonight? If the answer was yes, he met every single one. Sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for an hour. Sometimes he gave away scarves, sometimes rings, sometimes guitars. Never because cameras were watching. Usually, there were no cameras at all. Only families who would remember those moments forever. Charlie once asked him why. Elvis smiled. Because one little boy reminded me what music is supposed to do. Nearly a year later, Elvis received another letter. This one came from Margaret. Inside was a photograph. It showed Danny sitting on the stage during that unforgettable television broadcast. The guitar rested across his lap. His smile filled the entire picture. On the back, Margaret had written only one sentence. For 72 hours, my son forgot he was dying. He only remembered he was living. Elvis stared at those words for a long time. Then he quietly framed the photograph. According to those closest to him, it remained in his private room for years. Whenever life became overwhelming, he would sometimes stop in front of it, not to remember sadness, but to remember purpose. Because fame fades, records are broken, concerts end, crowds go home. But kindness echoes long after the final note has disappeared, and somewhere beyond the reach of television cameras, beyond headlines, beyond history, perhaps a little boy still sat beneath brighter lights than any stage on earth, waiting with an old guitar in his hands, saving a seat for a friend who had once kept a promise.